that rendered her pregnant with Abraham's child. At the time when Lewis worked, there were questions about the ability of Africans to feel pain, both physical and moral. And so, like children, they must be overseen by a more benign, mature race of people. In her sculpture, Lewis answered the question of morality with a definitive yes. And her choice of Cleopatra is very interesting. There were ongoing debates in the 19th century about Cleopatra's race. Her mother was Egyptian. Her father was descended from the Ptolemy. And so abolitionists tended to say, yes, Cleopatra was black. And because, for them, racial traits transcend history. Right? To be black in 32 AD is the same as it is in 1963, which is, of course, not the case. But the stakes were high because Cleopatra was the historical analog to the biblical racial theories. And so abolitionists said, of course she was black, and it proves that black Africans can ably oversee an empire. And pro-slavery advocates said, of course she wasn't black. The story of Egypt is the story of Aryan superiority, that the servants and slaves of ancient Egypt were Nubian, sub-Saharan African, thus proving that racial relations were stable all along. Edmonia Lewis steps out of the debate and goes to the Vatican libraries and finds these coins, one of Mark Antony, one of Cleopatra, and models the profile of her Cleopatra based on an archaeological find. And so she steps out of the debate about Cleopatra's race, whether white or black, and goes for archaeological accuracy. And Cleopatra's decision to kill herself rather than be a prisoner of Rome, a slave, is a triumphant ending. It was the kind of stereotypical triumphant ending for women in the 19th century. There was a general obsession with suicidal women in the 19th century. Whether it was Sappho or Cleopatra or Ophelia, the historian, it's escaping, but suicide was considered a speaking silence. And so, consistently, in Lewis's work, men are the bearers of race and racial traits and physiognomies. You can see that in the curly hair of her black subject, in the aquiline nose of the old arrow maker relative to his daughter Minnehaha. Over and over again in her earliest works, men are the bearers of race. And so, in this way, she fights the collapse between herself and her artwork. Walker, on the other hand, as opposed to do the work, be the work. And over again, you see how she inserts herself in her own work. And in the early days of her career, art magazines thought it was quite clever to photograph her as a silhouette. Her as her work. Carol Walker has been a force in the art world since the mid-1990s, while the subject of her work has varied little since then. Through costuming and suggestive titling, she invokes 19th century slavery, as well as the controlling images of African Americans that abound from that era. Mammies, pickaninnies, sambos, coons, etc. What distinguishes black people from white people in her silhouettes is a combination of dress and either the presence or absence of caricature, a formula made popular by anti-abolitionist propagandists such as Edward C. Clay. Born in 1969 in Stockton, California, Walker received her BFA from the Atlanta College of Art in 1991 and her MFA from the Rhode Island School of Design in 1994. And she says she found herself uncomfortable and afraid to address race within her art during her early college years. However, she found her voice on this topic while attending RISD for her master's, where she began introducing race into her art. And she's had a storied career, winning the MacArthur Genius Award at age 24, and she's represented the US in biennials across the globe, and is perhaps the most famous and celebrated artist of our time. In part, this is due to the United States' continued obsession with race, sex, and violence. And Walker's engagement with that obsession was duly noted by the Walker Art Center when they acquired her piece titled "The Means to an End." As the label gleefully describes, Carol Walker's art takes an irreverent, humorous, ghoulish, and all-around fantastical look at the underbelly of America's obsessions with race, sex, and violence. Her large black and white silhouettes draw from iconography ranging from the pre-Civil War period of America's South, historical romance novels, commercial culture, and slave narratives. Through a collusion of fact and fiction, she creates a complex reading of history that is at once seductive and terrifying. At first glance, her work appears innocent in its fairy tale-like rendering. A closer inspection, however, reveals its many perverse twists and outlandish situations. So that was the Walker Art Center's description. And while I would take issue with the label copy's description of a complex reading of history, I do feel that Walker's images of wacky, sexy time on the plantation do engage contemporary culture in complex ways and on a global scale. And this is from an exhibition at the Driscoll Center, at the University of Maryland College Park, and it was an exhibition titled "Emancipating the Past, Unchained the Future." And it says, Carol Walker is one of the most successful and widely known contemporary African-American artists today. She is remarkable for her radical engagements with issues of race, gender, and sexuality, and the media with which she pursues her studies. Though mainly celebrated for her provocative installations composed of cut paper silhouettes, Walker's work in other media is equally strong and expands on the many powerful themes and questions of her practice. Drawn from Jordan Schnitzer's collection, the exhibition includes several of Walker's large-scale print series, cut steel sculptures, a wall painting, and a video. The works selected display the range of approaches Walker has taken to explore the legacy of slavery for contemporary American identity. And then it tells you who this exhibition was organized by, but take a look at the panelists. The moderator was Michelle Wallace. She's the daughter of Faith Ringgold and the author of Myth of the Superwoman. The panelists, Dr. Ira Berlin, who's the American Distinguished University Professor of History at the University of Maryland. Dr. Lamar Jarrell Bruce was Assistant Professor in the Department of American Studies. Professor Curly Holton was Executive Director of the Driscoll Center. And all the way down to an attorney, art collector, art consultant, and then a performance artist. Through her work, Walker gleefully represents the atrocity adjacent. And while not attempting images of freedom, narratives of emancipation are constantly attached to her subject. The OED, Oxford English Dictionary, defines guise as an external form, appearance, or manner of presentation, typically concealing the true nature of something. I won't quibble with the idea of true nature, an ideological redundancy. Rather, I would ask that you engage the idea of history as itself a guise in the work of Carol Walker. History is a guise in her work. In a nation that wants to excise slavery from school textbooks, where students are taught to take tests at the expense of learning history and civics, the mess that we have made of ourselves is nowhere more apparent than in the breathless reporting of everything that Walker does. As the exhibition text states, the works selected display the range of approaches Walker has taken to explore the legacy of slavery for contemporary American identity. This is a tall and impossible order, but over and over again, the guise of history, abetted by some of the most towering intellects and scholars of slavery, emancipation, and Reconstruction, exposes the complexity of irony relative to Walker's work. Her work serves over and over again as illustration of these histories. The scholars who are rallied to comment on her work or to talk alongside it, and who participate in public programming, serve as the convincing voices that provide the reality effect, first noted by Roland Barthes and developed by Linda Nochlin in her essay, The Imaginary Orient. Such details, Nochlin writes, supposedly there to denote the real directly, are actually there simply to signify its presence in the work as a whole. As Barthes points out, the major function of gratuitous, accurate details like these is to announce we are the real. They are signifiers of the category of the real. They are to give credibility to the realness of the work as a whole, to authenticate the total visual field as a simple, artless reflection. The contingent forces, end of quote, the contingent forces of programming and exhibit form what I call authenticating gestures in the work of Carol Walker. The subject of the panel discussion, Emancipating the Past, Unchain the Future, represents one more hyperbolic example of the heavy lifting that Walker's work is supposed to do. In fact, her work has become the 21st century's version of what Marcus Wood terms the officially sanctioned arts of emancipation. Except in Walker's world, slavery is eternal, but conversely liberating. And if you're interested in Marcus Wood, he wrote an amazing book. He's the most exasperated art historian I know, and so therefore a hero of mine. But the book is The Horrible Gift of Freedom, Atlantic Slavery and the Representation of Emancipation, published in 2010. Indicative of the importance of Walker's work to African American history is that it is now included as part of the Advanced Placement Art History exam. And out of 250 required works, there are only 4 by African Americans. And there's no performance art, no installation art, no works of abstraction. All of the work is from the 20th century. It's Jean-Michel Basquiat's jazz players, Jacob Lawrence, a panel from the Migration series, Faith Ringgold's Dancing at the Louvre, and Carol Walker's Darkytown Rebellion. In those schools that do teach slavery, and for those students who excel enough to participate in the AP program, Walker's work will provide the visual accompaniment to the history of slavery. In those schools that do not teach the history of slavery, Walker's work will be the only context for their knowledge. The 5-year-long revision of the Art History Advanced Placement exam culminated in October 2013 with the official announcement of the new and improved test that was supposed to be more representative and inclusive of other cultures. There are at least 3 aspects of irony as it relates to Walker's art. First, that irony demands of its audience shared context, recognition, and conventions. Should those conditions not be met, those who express differences of opinion are charged with visual illiteracy and with wanting to censor her work. The second aspect of irony as it functions within her art is the illusion of power granted to those few vocal critics of Walker. The twin deployment of irony and censorship, however, takes place outside of a broader cultural framework. It disregards and downplays context where institutional support for Walker can levy infinite resources to make her visible and relevant in the form of exhibitions and scholarship. As Linda Hutchin astutely observes in her book, Irony's Edge, the theory and politics of irony, published in 2013, quote, because irony as defined in the study happens in something called discourse, the semantics and syntactic dimensions cannot be considered separately from the social, historical, and cultural aspects of its context of deployment and attribution. Issues of authority and power are encoded in that notion of discourse today in much the same way that in earlier times they were encoded in the word rhetoric. To discuss irony as speech act, but outside of this broader political frame, is to risk idealizing communication as a reciprocal, utopic exchange, and thus minimizing the workings of power by downplaying something crucial to irony's complexity, the fact that agents do not characteristically engage in speech acts from positions of equal advantage or conduct their transactions on an equal footing. So this is a painting that I worked with for 4 years at the Art Institute of Chicago when I was employed as an educator. And it's a painting by Auguste Bernard d'Aguechy, and it's Lady reading the letters of Heloise and Abelard, made in around 1780. And it addresses a concern in French society in the late 18th century with educated women free to read texts that may be morally challenging for a delicate feminine sensibility, right? So Heloise was a brilliant scholar of Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. She had a reputation for intelligence and insight. Abelard was originally from the nobility, and he rejected a knighthood in order to be a philosopher. And he hears about this woman, this brilliant woman, and he decides to approach her uncle and become her tutor. They end up having a passionate affair. Her uncle castrates Abelard, and he becomes a monk. She becomes an abbess, and they exchange passionate letters, right? And so instead, this happens in the 12th century. So fast forward to 1780, and we have our educated young woman reading the letters and inspiring her to such passions that she's twisting out of her dress. Right? So even as this painting is a morality tale about the dangers of teaching wealthy women and wealthy young girls to read, it also titillates us. Right? It's sexy even as it warns of sexiness. Right? It's the way that it's a mess. And you know that one of the causes in the 19th century, if you fast forward a little bit, one of the causes of female hysteria was thought to be overeducation and riding bikes. And so, yeah, don't get me started on that. So here you have moralizing representation, right? That has this dual function of, finger wagging, but also pleasure, right? The pleasure of watching her read, and she's basically having an orgasm. She's reading these passionate letters from a castrated monk and the brilliant abbess. So who speaks for and to the nation? In 1832, Great Britain ended slavery, and as a nation was now free to imagine that it had always held human rights first in its heart. By 1840, it was time to memorialize the virtue of the empire. In his book, Blind Memory, Visual Representations of Slavery in England and America, 1780 to 1865, my favorite curmudgeon, Marcus Wood, poses the question thusly: what did mid-Victorian audiences want from a painting of the Middle Passage? They had two choices: Turner's Slave Ship or Francois Billard's The Slave Trade. And I'll let you guess which one won. But this is Turner's painting, and when it was shown at the Royal Academy, it shows slavers throwing Africans overboard during a storm. And during its premiere at the Royal Academy, it was the subject of ridicule and laughter, and as well as deliberate misunderstanding. They especially laughed at this leg of an African woman chained, being eaten by white fish, consumed by white fish. It's the metaphor of the rapacity, right? The endless hunger of empire for free labor. It is an indictment of whiteness. It is an indictment over the fact that the Atlantic Ocean is the burial ground for millions of Africans. But the English public rejected this painting. According to Wood, in the Royal Academy, the slave ship hung close by the French painter Auguste Piart's Scene on the African Coast, which provided a different and more accessible account of the slave trade. Contemporary reviewers were in no doubt about the merits of the two pictures. Piart's painting received universal applause, and it was bought and presented to Sir Thomas Fowell Buxton. Piart's painting was praised for its clean narrative, its pathos, and its cleverness in rendering so many dark complexions. Turner's painting had no such clarity. Several of the reviewers compared the two works. The English novelist William Makepeace Thackeray observed about the Piart painting, quote, "The scene is laid upon the African coast. King Tom or King Boy has come with troops of slaves down the Cora and sits in the midst of his chiefs and mistresses, one a fair creature, not much darker than a copper teacup, bargaining with a French dealer," end of quote. In Thackeray's criticism, the rules for how the slave trade should be presented to a mid-19th century English audience seem to be as follows. The scene should be exotic and abroad. Atrocities should be carried out by foreigners. Unchristian Africans should be ridiculed as foolish barbarians, whose color is of its nature laughable, and a clear narrative pumped with detail is essential. And as Wood notes, one detail above all others leads Thackeray into ecstasies. This is a quote from Thackeray. "Yonder is a poor woman kneeling before a Frenchman." There she is. She is, let's see, her shoulder is fizzing under the hot iron with which he brands her. She is looking up shuddering and wild, yet quite mild and patient. It breaks your heart to look at her. I never saw anything so exquisitely pathetic as that face. God bless you, Monsieur Piart, for painting it. It stirs the heart more than 100,000 tracts, reports, or sermons. It must convert every man who has seen it. You, British government, who have given 20 million to the freeing of this hapless people, give yet a couple of thousand more to the French painter, and don't let his work go out of the country now that it is here. Let it hang alongside the Hogarth in the National Gallery. It is good as the best of them." End of quote. Now this 20 million he mentions given to the freeing of these hapless people, this was 20 million pounds in 1840s currency given to British slaveholders. The reparations went to the slaveholders rather than the slaves. But to continue, and indeed the painting by Piart was purchased for the Abolition Society, and colored engravings and lithographs circulated internationally for several decades, while the painting by Turner was exiled to Boston. Wood pulls no punches in his assessment. And before I go on, I should just say that this scene was isolated for its own circulation. And this is what this is his summary of what this meant. Thackeray demands that the image be bought as England's just inheritance in its post-abolition phase. The nation should be rewarded with the purchase of pornography. The extravagant demand is set off by the excitement, the stirring, which he feels in response to the violent abuse of a half-naked black woman. Thackeray reads the image in a way which lays bare his own corrupt narrative expectations. The extraordinary emotional contradiction in the phrase describing her agony, shuddering and wild, yet quite mild and patient, embodies Thackeray's voyeuristic duplicity. He wants to see real suffering, but simultaneously he wants his slaves completely passive. There must be no suggestion of rebelliousness even under torture. A third aspect of irony, as it relates to Walker's work, is its elitism. As Claire Colebrook notes, the history of irony's elitism goes back to its emergence in Greek thought. Not only was irony defined as an art in keeping with an urbane and elevated personality, it was also recognized as practiced primarily in sites of political power. Irony as a trope is a means of effective persuasion in speeches, and therefore already relies on the established speaking position and force of the orator. As a figure or extended mode of thought, irony allows the speaker to remain above what he says, allowing those members of his audience who share his urbanity to perceive the true sense of what is really meant, end of quote. And so irony must construct two audiences, those who get it and those who don't, those who are inside and those who remain hopelessly outside. A case in point is a 2015 spectacle that took place at the defunct Domino sugar factory in Brooklyn. And here's a picture of it. Did any of you get a chance to see this work when it was in Brooklyn? This is the wall text for it. The behest of Creative Time, Kara E. Walker, has confected a subtlety of the marvelous sugar baby, an homage to the unpaid and overworked artisans who have refined our sweet tastes from the cane fields to the kitchens of the New World on the occasion of the demolition of the Domino sugar refining plant. And here's the armature. It was made by workers of styrofoam. And I was listening to NPR one morning and I heard Kara Walker rhapsodizing about this sculpture, imagining it being put outside and melting in the rain. Well, the armature is styrofoam. It's not going to ever melt, right? But, you know, that's part of the romance of the piece. Here's a detail. You can see how they did it. And you see the sugar residue on the ground. And people talked about the smell and how you walked away with it on the bottoms of your shoes and just how overwhelming it was. And there it is, installed with the molasses sugar babies that surrounded it. And there it is, being visited by the public. And here's the rear view. Now, the need for irony to construct two audiences is nowhere more apparent than in what happened at the Domino sugar factory, right? Tourists are always going to act up and act out at famous sites. It's what we do, right? Everybody has to have that picture. If you go to Pisa, holding up the tower, and they get creative, you know, like the third photograph. And with the rise of Instagram, you know, you snap a picture, you go to a museum, you misbehave, you look around for the guards, and you reenact the three graces, right, in front of a painting. Then you post it for the world to see. And this is some of the things that happened in the presence of the Sphinx. So you have that audience who went in a form of homage and kind of ritual mourning, and you know, we needed this sculpture in order to talk about sugar and slavery. Really, did we? And then you have, you know, these folk who are clearly having fun with the Sphinx. And it's pretty much, you know, the same. So what the disrespectful crowd did not know was that Walker was filming their reactions, and she was making screen grabs of their behavior on social media. And furthermore, their misbehavior, irony's second audience, if you will, would be on display in her high-end gallery at Chelsea, all for the delectation of irony's first audience, the art world insiders. And the show even had a name, Aftermath. And it was on view at Sakima Jenkins in Chelsea through Saturday, January 17, 2015. As Linda Hutchin reasons, when the West decides to be ironic about itself, it cannot avoid some relation to its others. it cannot avoid repeating the very colonialism it adopts, only ironically. However, I would argue that irony is merely a ploy in relationship to Walker's work. Just as we do things with words, we also do things with images. And the agency attributed to Walker's work is truly Herculean. Over the past 2 decades, pick up most journals and you will read how her art reappropriates, challenges, and overturns stereotype. How her art functions to chastise powerful institutions, like museums and galleries, which, ironically, continue to show her work. If her art was able to accomplish all that has been attributed to it, the world would be a much different place by now. And I would not need to ask, how does her art challenge power when it continues to be enshrined, validated, and authenticated at the very centers of power? What can we discern beyond the veil of irony? How does Walker's work engage contemporary culture? Can't stop, won't stop. 20+ years of the atrocity adjacent. So what does Walker's work do? What does it accomplish? And this is from the end of Uncle Tom and the grand allegorical tableau of Ava in Heaven. And here you see a one-legged man stabbing an infant, a black infant, through the chest, and fucking a little girl. And her work is weirdly kind of heterosexual in these instances. And so we come to, so what is helpful here too, right? We want to see real suffering, but unlike Thackeray, who wants his slaves completely passive, we want ours wholly complicit. And so we come to the conclusion of my talk this evening, and we arrive at what I believe to be the heart of the matter, the assertion of authenticity, which is ironically intended by Walker, but that is reinforced and reified by the various entities who generate interpretation and meaning. This assertion of authenticity collapses the body of the artist into her body of work. Especially in the early days of Walker's career, many journals and newspapers thought it a clever bit of visual trickery to reduce Walker to a silhouette, making her the equal of her creations. And it is the assertion of authenticity that comprises the labor, the work, if you will, of art as the commodification of racism and the reproduction of race. Over and over again, we witness the authenticating, playful ironies that enforce the sameness of Walker's race and that of her enslaved art commodities. The poster for Walker's exhibit at the Renaissance Society that I showed you earlier is one such instance of her playful sense of irony at work. In the poster, she advertises herself as a 19th century negress, etc. But unless that irony is wedded to what society deems racially authentic, then the blowback can be fearsome, and not even claims of empathy can save you. And here I am thinking specifically of the statement made by Dana Schutz in defense of her painting of Emmett Till that is on view at the most recent Whitney Biennial. In my work on Walker, just as in my work on Lewis, I hope to challenge the notion of authenticity. And I argue that what we actually find within it are the conditions for the manufacture of racism that then reifies race. Walker's popularity is actually symptomatic of the larger issues at work in our society, and that the ways in which her art is deployed actually serve us eidetically to make race real, but also mark slavery as elsewhere and in the past. We have never been post-racial. Our 45th president is the Black Lives Don't Matter president. He is the intellectual and racial antidote to Barack Obama. Throughout this all, through the presidencies of Bill Clinton, Bush, Obama, and Trump, one thing has remained consistent: Kara Walker's success in commodifying the atrocity adjacent, themselves so distant from the embodied experience of enslavement that we can be titillated and pleasured all under the guise of history and scopic activism.